This video will attempt to take everything that we've talked about up to now and show you that the men who wrote the Constitution had an overall plan when doing that. It wasn't just that as each one of these compromises came up, they kind of fitted into the right place. That's not really what happened. The men who wrote the Constitution had a plan, an overall direction that they wanted to go. Credit for that plan or overall direction for the writing of the Constitution goes to a gentleman by the name of James Madison. James Madison is given the name of the author of our Constitution. He's also known as the writer of our Constitution. And I think the title that he gets that's most convenient for us here is he also gets the title of architect of our Constitution. And this is a unique title, architect of the Constitution, because when we look at architects, they are not generally the men or women who actually go into these buildings that they design, use the hammer to drive the nails or to hang the sheetrock. They come up with the general idea of what this building should look like when they're done. They tell the carpenters and they tell the sheetrockers and they tell the plumbers and the electrician how everything should fit together so that the outcome they desire, this building that they've done drawings of, is what the end result will be. Madison kind of did that with the Constitution. Madison sat down and deliberated and thought long and hard about what do we really want this Constitution to look like? What are we designing this Constitution to do or to prevent or to encourage? We're going to take a look at the Madisonian model in this video. In creating the Constitution, which would create the new government that we would live under, the writers were attempting to prevent one primary thing, and that thing was they were trying to prevent tyranny of the majority. Let me give you a basic understanding or explanation of tyranny of the majority. And the first thing we need to realize going into tyranny of the majority is that people are self-interested. So when people get some power, they're going to use that power to benefit themselves. Talk much about this. But Madison takes that idea of tyranny of the majority and he realizes how powerful individual self-interest can be, especially if that individual self-interest is directly connected and tied to other people who have a similar self-interest. And if you can get enough people who have a similar self-interest as you, and you can create what we call a majority within a society, a majority means more than 50%. In that situation, if the majority rules all the time, and you create this majority of people who have common self-interest, then that majority, which may simply just be 50.1%, that majority could what we call tyrannize the minority. They would always use the power that they have as the majority to look out for themselves first and never worry about the minority. And Madison felt this was a huge issue because when we look at life under the Articles of Confederation, we talk a lot about the fact that if one small state like Rhode Island could stop the Articles from being amended, they would have a lot of power. But Madison, who didn't disagree with that statement, but Madison looked forward and said, yes, but a majority can be just as destructive as one small state with all the power if that majority uses that power in a way that always benefits themselves and never does anything to address the desires or rights of the minority. So real quickly, here's the definition I want you to understand. Tyranny of the majority is a situation where a group, which makes up more than 50% of the population, takes control and uses all the power they accumulate to help themselves always. Remember that. They always help themselves. And they never look out for the needs or rights of those not in the majority. So Madison realized if we created this system that simply was based on this idea of majority rule, there would be a problem. So we had to make sure that this government that we created did not put too much power in the hands of the majority. Now it's maybe oversimplifying things to say that Madison feared the majority. You need to realize that when Madison was talking about fearing the majority, he was talking about a particular group of people in the country at this time. He wasn't worried about a majority of the founding fathers coming together and creating, a majority. Because the founding fathers themselves was a small group of people. And even if all of the founding fathers could come together and agree on things, they still would not have made up a majority within any single state or within the country as a whole. So when we talk about Madison fearing the majority, really who he's talking about is the masses. He's talking about the average everyday voter, the average everyday American citizen. Because remember that the average everyday citizen, even at this time in our history, was basically a person that was worrying about self-sufficiency. They were putting a roof over their head. They were providing food for their family. They were providing those types of things. And the majority of people in this country at the time that the Constitution was written were not wealthy individuals who had extra time or extra resources to be spending on things like reading the philosophers of the day or really being deeply involved in how the government should run. And the reason that Madison feared the masses so much was because if the masses could come together and become a majority quickly, if they could identify a group of themselves that would make up a majority, they could very quickly take over a government. And then if they quickly take over the government, then all of the decisions that these masses would make would benefit them and would not benefit the Founding Fathers. I'm not saying the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution just to protect themselves, but they realized that if they spent all of this time creating this document, creating this government that was based on all of this very logical, philosophical thought, and they simply turned that government that they just created over to the masses who had no experience running government, they realized there would be a major problem. So in short, the number one reason that Madison feared the masses and feared that the masses could create a majority was because Madison and most of the other founding fathers believed the masses in this country, the average person in this country, to be ignorant. And I want to be careful when we use the word ignorant, because if somebody walks up to me and tells me I'm ignorant, I personally am not going to get offended unless they say something like, well, you're ignorant about the Constitution. Then I'm going to be offended because I should know something about the Constitution. I teach it. But if somebody walks up to me and says, I'm ignorant about quantum physics, I'm not going to be offended because that's true. Because the word ignorant just simply means I don't know. So when Madison said that we had to fear the masses because they could quickly create a majority, and that majority would be ignorant, what he was talking about is that they would be ignorant about the ability to run a government. If you're spending all day worrying about, keeping food on the table and a roof over your head and those types of things, and you're not spending time studying the governmental processes and the philosophies and all those things, then you're going to be ignorant about government. Think about it. If I was asked to teach a class at the university about quantum physics, what would happen? That class would be an utter failure because I know nothing about quantum physics. So if the men who create the Constitution take this government they just created, this guidebook that they've just created, and hand it over to the ignorant masses and say, now you guys run the government, they were afraid that there would be a very similar catastrophe, that the government would fail. Now, we're going to take a real quick look here that Madison said to prevent tyranny of the majority, to prevent these ignorant masses from gaining control of the government, there were three things that we had to do. And what he said was we have to place as much of the government beyond the control of the masses. We don't want the masses to be able to quickly gain control of all aspects of the government. The second thing we want to talk about is, or what Madison said we need to address, is we need to separate the powers of the different governmental institutions. And then the third thing Madison said is we need to construct a system of checks and balances. Now, At this point, I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to spend any more time in this video talking about separation of powers between government institutions, nor am I going to talk any more about checks and balances, because I believe we have a good understanding about those. And if you don't, you need to go back to some of the previous videos we had and review what it meant that we separated powers and that we created a system of checks and balances. And if you review them again, keep in mind that part of the reason we're creating these checks and balances and creating these separation of powers is that just in case the majority can gain control, it's going to be very difficult for them to gain control of all three branches simultaneously. And if the masses gain control of one branch, there's a system of checks and balances to prevent that majority from becoming tyrannical.